We'll bring the March meeting of the Historic Zoning Commission to order. Brenda, do we have a quorum? We do. Okay. Then are there any, is there any discussion about the minutes from our last meeting or any corrections to be made?
Mr. Chairman, I have one correction under absent. Ms. Belcher and Mr. Thompson were here. We need to eliminate those, and they are on the correct side of members present, but for some reason, Brenda, they got on the opposite side also. Other than that, I have no corrections.
Anybody else? Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Minutes approved. Mr. Lewis, I'll turn the meeting over to you.
Okay. In the absence of the chairman and the vice chairman, we'll have to elect a chairman just to preside over the meeting and just continue as we're doing. So I'll take nominations for chairman from the commission.
I nominate Ms. Anderson.
Second.
Nomination cease. All those in favor say aye.
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 Okay. Thank you.
Welcome aboard, Mr. Chairman. Today's meeting, we have some guests with us. We talked after the meeting last month about having some experts come in who are familiar with historic districts and work with them all the time. And we have with us Jim Thompson, who is a member of our Historic Commission, and Mr. Dan Brown, who's with the State Historic Preservation Office in Nashville. And they're going to talk this afternoon about materials that are being used in historic districts. I've included in your agenda materials some handouts that was given to me by Mr. Thompson, and Mr. Brown has distributed some leaflets and brochures, I think, for that's going to assist us, hit them in this discussion this afternoon. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Thompson, since he's familiar with the commission.
Good afternoon. My name's Dan Brown. I'm the Certified Local Government Coordinator with the Tennessee Historical Commission with the State Preservation Office, State Historic Preservation Office. And thank you for inviting me here this afternoon to talk to you about, I guess, materials, technical issues. Feel free to interrupt me at any time and ask questions. If you'll bear with me for a minute, I want to start off particularly on a couple of issues related to. Of course, you're one of what we call one of the crown jewels of historic preservation here in the state. You're one of 33 communities that are certified local governments, and as such, you've taken the extraordinary steps of official protection and ordinance protection of your historic districts, which is the most powerful protection in the United States, much more powerful than the National Register or any federal regulations. And this community and you embody that effort that your community has taken and manages on an ongoing basis, which is local legislation. So I want to congratulate you on that and thank you for being part of the certified program. Let me start off by saying we've got the Statewide Preservation Conference, which is hosted by the Tennessee Preservation Trust. It's going to be in Cookeville this year for March 16th through 18th. Our agency, our commission, underwrites that through federal grants that we administrate and manage, underwrite that program. So this is the statewide conference that's done yearly. With that is going to be what's called a CAMP, which is Commission Assistance Mentoring Program, which is conducted by the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions, and it's literally the premier preservation training in the United States. We have three trainers that are going to be coming in from different parts of the United States that are going to be conducting this training. That's going to be on Thursday, May 16th. Now, for every certified local government, one person from the certified local government is allowed to come to the camp and the conference free, and that's in Cookeville. So it's offered to our certified local government coordinators, but if Mr. Lewis is unable to attend, and he has the full authority to appoint someone else on the commission. At the same time, we encourage anyone that has not attended the training before to attend it. I think we had training in Franklin, I want to say in 2008, 2009. We had Greenville in 2010, 2012 we had Nashville. So some of you may have attended some of that training in the last few years. But this is the premier training. It's only $45, and it'll be from 8:30 to 4:30 on Thursday for anyone that's not, receiving a free attendance as a CLG coordinator. So this is it, and there's a number of sessions there. We got a legal session and a number of other sessions on how to be a commissioner, and particularly the major challenges that commissioners have. And you're getting top-notch people. This is the premier training module in the United States for commissioners. So I would highly encourage you to attend if you can. You can sign up online. The Tennessee Preservation Trust has a website. You can go on the website there and sign up. And please don't hesitate. I've given you all my card, my business card for contact. You're welcome to contact me through my email or telephone there. You've also got my cell phone number. You're welcome to contact me at any time if you have any questions about that, evenings or weekends or whatever. Grants. Let me talk about that briefly. I don't think you have a standing grant, Mr. Lewis, or grant request into our office from last year. But due to the situation with the Congress and up in Washington, D.C., and the, I guess, undecisive nature of the future budgets, the grants that would normally have been awarded about this time of year are still in limbo. So we have what we think is going to be funding that is going to be able to fund the standing grants applications that we have. We're anticipating, and everything that we are being indicated from Washington is that they will probably be funded at similar levels to what they've been funded in the past, and that when notice is received of that, the final determination will be made through our agency, and then the governor will make an official announcement, which we think may be in April. It could be later this year, depending upon Congress, and as we know, no one knows what's going to happen up there. Now, the new grant cycle, the application for new grants begins in June. It's June, July, August, in September 1st. And I put out a notice, as I do every year, explaining what are the ways to apply for a grant. You're welcome to vet them through me. It's my job to help you get a grant. CLGs have an automatic 10% advantage applying for grants. 10% of all the funds that we receive, which I think is in the range of hundreds of thousands of dollars, 10% of that has to, by law, go to certified local governments, or we have to return it to Congress. It can't be used by another city or another state. So these funds are there every year, and it's my job to help you get one of those grants. They're 60-40 matching grants, but the matching can be in kind, or a match of cash and in kind or cash. So there's a number of ways that you can match those grants and get those grants. I'll be happy to explain any of it to you. Again, I'll send out an email closer to the time, but and I will help you if you want to throw around a couple of ideas and we'll talk about some needs, or if you have some needs in your community. There are two basic kinds of grants. You have your brick and mortar, and then we have the other types of grants, which are going to be for things like surveys and design guidelines and other planning. They're planning grants, so any type of planning in your community, master plans, etc. So, anything that you want to discuss as far as your commission or what your needs are, feel free to communicate with me. And again, I'll be sending out an email to Mr. Lewis notifying him as we get closer. I brought you these brochures tonight, which are technical preservation services, publications, and online materials. And if you see, they're organized by subject in here. So you'll see materials, you're going to see information on historic districts, you're going to see, all types of things. It's a very broad and extremely detailed list of resources here. And it lists the online resources and some other ways to access this information. In fact, Jim and I were talking before this. It used to be the preservation briefs we kept, and we still have copies of many of them in our office. But nowadays, almost all of them are available online and can be easily downloaded and printed. So this is a resource to access some of those. One of the things I want to talk to, everyone's familiar with preservation briefs, I find, but there's also another aspect of technical reports. So this refers to some of those, but as a category, you can go online and Google the technical reports, National Park Service technical reports, and they're typically more in detail reports on how to do particularly technical procedures. That's what they're all about for historic preservation. So they're an extremely helpful resource. And again, our agency is a resource for all of this. So if you are having a challenge, if you've got a question, call us and call me at any time. Email me. I'll be happy to help you track it down. We're also tied in with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, which does the camp and other training. But with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, they're also a resource to answer questions. They put out a quarterly publication that deals with all types of technical issues and procedural issues for our commissions. We're also tied into the National Park Service and to their email tree, their listservs. So we got listservs with National Park Service, listservs with NAPC, and you're a part of a group of about 18 to 1900 communities in the United States, and I have a listserv to be able to get a hold of all of them as well. So if you do have a challenge or an issue within your commission, don't think you're alone, and don't think someone else hasn't faced it and probably dealt with it successfully before. So that's one of the main reasons I'm here, is to help make that work for you, okay, and help find answers for you when these things come up, or the conflicts come up, or the needs come up. So feel free to give me a call. One of the issues I want to talk to you about tonight, and again, feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions, sustainability. You can't pick up a magazine or newspaper today that doesn't have an article in there about sustainability and its emergence in our communities. The Department of Interior National Park Service has put out an illustrated guidelines on sustainability for rehabilitating historic districts. So you can also apply for a grant through us to upgrade your design guidelines, and I'll be happy to help facilitate that for you. Design guidelines are one of our highest priorities for funding in our grant program. So if you think it's time to look at your design guidelines from a couple of perspectives or one perspective, let us know. We'd be happy to help you get a grant to upgrade that. But this is done in such a way, and it's all downloadable online. I'm going to leave this copy with your commission here, so you'll have it as a resource. But you can see it's set up the same way most guidelines are set up, so you can actually download this, plug it into your guidelines, or utilize it. It's public information. You can utilize it any way that works for your commission. The big thing that's coming, yes, sir.
Dan, I'm sorry for interrupting. I just
Please,
want
please
ask
do.
one question, if you could answer very briefly for us,
Right.
but also for the folks that watch on TV. Define what a certified local government is very briefly, and what that allows us to do, what the requirements are for us to be a certified local government, and what it permits us to do.
Very much so. Okay. The CLG program is an amendment to the Preservation Act of 1966, was done in the 1980s, and created the CLG program, which essentially helped establish a certification, or a very organized way that historic zoning commissions could be formed and would function in states. Out of that came Tennessee Code. In the Tennessee Code annotated came the state enabling legislation that sets the guidelines, the legal guidelines in this state for how a historic zoning commission may be set up, what rights it has, and then what limitations it has in its authority. The certified program is essentially a way that is funded by the National Park Service that comes down through the State Historic Preservation Office, which is the Tennessee Historical Commission here in Tennessee. And what we do is help any community that would like. It's all voluntary. It's 100%. And communities may remove themselves from it at any time. But we set up an organized approach towards historic zoning and running and setting up and running historic commissions. So what we do is help the cities. It's a complex process. Setting up a historic zoning commission is going to involve the mayor, your planning commission, and the city council, your business community. It's also going to involve your neighborhood groups and your neighborhoods, and without question, the affected properties. So it's a complex way it's a very complex group of people that are going to be involved with that. What we help is understand how to based upon national models and patterns, how to set that up and how to do it. Then once you do it, and once a community makes that commitment to it, and it's ordinance-based. So this commission and your commission, all certified commissions, are ordinance-based historic zoning commissions. As such, they have legal power to enforce zoning laws. Under Tennessee Code Annotated, particularly, they can only be appealed to Chancery Court. So they do not have administrative review or planning commission review or city council review. So that essentially, if there's a challenge to a decision, it would go to Chancery Court. And what we help do is manage that from all of the technical issues, administrative issues, legal issues, any sort of challenges or questions that historic zoning commissions have. We're a resource to do that. And what we help is we have of course, there's a federal manual, and then we have a sort of a state guidelines of how to run your zoning commission. And then every state has a certified local government coordinator, and I'm that person in the state. My job specifically is to make all this work. By becoming a CLG, you also become a priority community for our agency from a variety of perspectives. We oversee, under the Historic Preservation Act, a broad range of federal programs. The National Register, I think you're very familiar with, Section 106 review, which planners are all familiar with because it involves oversight and consideration of National Register properties whenever there's federal expenditures in any community of any amount whatsoever. So we oversee that. Also surveys and federal tax credits, which are an extension of the Federal Preservation Act. So if that helps to understand it, but it involves a very special commitment from a community. Now, communities are allowed to set up historic zoning commissions without being a certified local government. They still have to follow the state enabling legislation, but they usually don't have the resources and often aren't interfacing with our agency. And I often find there's a handful of communities that have done it successfully, but it usually, I find they often fall by the wayside, or that they lack sort of support or functioning in certain areas, particularly in enforcement or things like that. So we're there to help on a variety of levels and I guess help coordinate and help make the agencies function. So does that kind of help explain it to you?
And then the members of the commission are other continuing education requirements or anything?
Absolutely. Well, a couple of the advantages we offer is free training, just like the camp that we spoke about is official training. Part of it is free. Also, the grant program is there, so that the commissioners have requirements to maintain at least one person in the commission to go to maintain some type of training on a yearly basis. We also have legal. We help make sure that there's an understanding of the responsibilities for operating legally, which means following state sunshine laws, public notices, proper, Robert's Rules of Order and proper procedures for the conduct of commissions, et cetera. And we monitor that. We have, yearly reports, and there are yearly reports to the federal government, and we help monitor that and help make that work for you. But the biggest thing is we have no say in the operation. We have no legal control in the operate. It's all local. All of the legal control and the legal functioning is a local level. And what we are more than anything else is a resource to help make it work for you. We're not here to exercise any onerous official oversight or to in any way function as a legal control over the commission. It's here to help make things work for you and here to be a functional resource with all the other federal programs and with the functioning of your commission.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions on that? I'd be happy to help clarify that to anyone. Let's see, sustainability, back on that track. I guess one of the biggest issues facing everyone are the solar panels coming into historic districts. That's the most common. Some of the larger cities, CLGs are across the spectrum. All the big cities in the state are CLGs, and you guys are, one of the larger cities. At the same time, we've got LaGrange, which is 150 people. We've got, Sparta. We've got McMinnville. We've got, Columbia. We've got Jonesboro. We've got Bolivar, all over the state, 33 communities. So they're all different kinds of sizes. So it's not just for one, like where main streets are primarily for small communities or smaller or medium-sized to smaller communities. This program is for all different sized communities. So from a sustainability standpoint, there are a lot of challenges that are cropping up in all different sized communities. But for medium-sized and smaller communities, I guess the biggest challenge out here are the solar panels going up and some of the skylights that are going in. So there's guidelines in here as to what the Secretary of the Interior and what we call SOI, Secretary of Interior Standards, recommend for what you would consider for historic districts and to maintain the authenticity and the historic character of your districts. So I'll leave that here with your commission. With these, some of these other guidelines, and many of them are, this one in particular is available online, illustrated guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings. As you know, there are 4 basic treatments for historic structures and places, and rehabilitation is the most common treatment, which you're going to take a historic building, you're going to maintain its historic character, but you're going to make it function for modern uses, and very often you're going to do an adaptive reuse for a structure. So these are the main guidelines that would affect much of what you do. There's also some other comprehensive guidelines, and again, all of these are available online for the most part, or they're government-produced documents that can be usually readily had. But this is guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing the 4 basic treatments for historic preservation for historic buildings. So these are other resources for you as well. In talking about sustainability, I think the other broad expression of that is green. And of course, the historic preservation industry has always promoted itself as green. It's one of our most common comments is the greenest building is the one that's already been built. Is the embodied energy in there, all the things you don't have to build or tear down to build it. At the same time, with green, I want to say that there's within historic preservation, a caveat that's coming with green. If you look under some of the green standards, I guess one of the biggest issues we're seeing with green is windows, which is probably one of our biggest issues in historic preservation in general. Windows are probably one of the most significant character-defining elements of any structure. Very, very important that they be maintained. And I would say it's one of the biggest issues and conflicts that we're seeing in almost every community that we go into. It's national. There are tons of resources out here on windows. If you look in here, if you look in the preservation briefs, if you look in the technical reports, and again, I'm a resource to help you look for solutions. And for an individual builder, an individual business person down here that's looking for a solution, I'm happy to talk with anybody. In Middle Tennessee, we're fairly blessed with a lot of good contractors now that are happy to bid on commercial projects and even in residential projects, and that nearby to Nashville, you've got good access to contractors that are experienced rehabilitating historic windows. So I highly recommend that. But within the green industry, they're often, and some of the programs coming out of D.C. now are encouraging the replacement of windows with so-called more efficient green, what they're calling green windows. So there are a few caveats. Also, the LEED certification is focused in some areas that aren't always 100% preservation, and they're focused on issues within the community about the way you would function in a building rather than, and it's sometimes we have a few odds with, it comes to odds with preservation in a few small ways. So I have to say, when you approach green, I think we as preservationists have to make sure that we properly integrate it with our design guidelines and our needs in our historic districts. There can be from time to time, and windows are our biggest issue out here, so I would only caution you in that in a small way. Couple of main points that we're having out here with, as I go across the state, the things I see. Roofing right now, there's a major effort at these modestly priced standing seam metal roofs that are typically in very bright colors. And you'll see them in very bright blues and greens and things like this. And they typically are, where we often see roofing as a replaceable material, that there's a lot of flexibility upon with its uses or replacements in historic districts. I think what we're seeing now is that some of these materials are incompatible in historic environments. And one recent example is in Johnson City. They have a conservation district there that essentially allows the replacement of certain materials doesn't require that they have to replace in kind in some ways. It deals with character rather than character and fabric. So in that town, they were getting a lot of these roofs. When you look down these historic streets, you would see these very historic views down there and streetscapes, and then all of a sudden you see these bright roofs. Well, they decided, and I worked with them recently to come up with new design guidelines that limit the replacement of roofs in those districts and essentially upgrade the districts from conservation districts to historic districts or preservation districts. And they just felt that these roofs were intruding, were a visual intrusion into the historic environment. And I'm finding that all across the state. Those roofs can be appropriate, and particularly if they're trying to emulate a historic roof that was metal, and particularly within a reasonable color range, but that I'm seeing now in some of these rural districts that you've got these beautiful old 19th century farm buildings that all of a sudden have this unusual blue, bright blue roof on it. And these are, I think it's being seen more and more by communities and the industry in general as a visual intrusion into the historic landscape. So I want to say that's something I would mention to you to be aware of in your community, and something as far as a design guideline issue you may want to consider as you talk about how to finesse and deal with your guidelines here. Windows, and I mentioned that briefly. Please, call us for help. We're also looking. We've got a handful of grant applications in for window training classes that we hope to do in 2013 and 2014 across the state. A number of communities have put in grant applications, and we're hoping to be able to fund those when we get our grant information straight with Congress. But issues are going to be windows are going to be an ongoing issue here. Have been for years. They're going to be for many years to come, and they're going to be a focus of our agency and the entire industry. So don't. When they're gone, they're very difficult and very expensive to replace. And there are very easy ways to make them energy efficient. There's interior storm windows, there's exterior storm windows that are much less expensive than replacing them. And all the economic, and again, we're happy to share the economic research that's been done on this, but all the economic research that we've seen on this, and it's been very extensive. I can't tell you the dozens and dozens of efforts that have been made on this, is that it's virtually impossible to replace those windows and ever have them pay for themselves in energy savings compared to what it would cost you to make your historic windows energy efficient. And by working on them every 50 years or so, the numbers never add up for new windows. And I keep telling everyone that we ought to let the window and door people do the fundraising for historic preservation, because, boy, they're good at selling things, and they're very good at making money. And that at the same time, we really need to, this is one of our biggest challenges. So please let us be a resource to help with that. Okay, please let us see how we can be a part of that. Siding. Historic siding is another issue. I think it's still it's a very big challenge. It's a gigantic challenge in the communities that I'm recruiting now to become certified local governments. Again, the window and siding folks have done an outstanding job of promoting and developing their products. And again, the benefits of siding can basically never pay for themselves, but that also, once the siding and the windows, if you have an area that or a building that you ever want to be on the National Register, or if you have a historic district that you would like, or an area that you would like to have become a historic district, if it has been too heavily intruded with replaced windows and synthetic siding, the ability to be on the National Register and develop that for tax credits and for other recognition has been greatly reduced and sometimes impossible. So it is an important consideration. I think the two biggest issues that relate to ability to become historic districts and the ability to become National Register districts are windows and siding. So those are extremely important issues to address and for your commission to address and control. Yes, sir. Mr.
Do you include hardy plank siding in that category?
Okay. Always exceptions, and the hardy plank's an outstanding example. And again, I was previously deputy director of the Vieux Carré Commission, the agency that oversaw the French Quarter, before I came here. down there. And our district was a National Historic Landmark District, NHL district, which was one of the very few in the United States. In limited circumstances, we allowed hardy plank, particularly where it was 2 or 3 stories off the ground. We had these tiny little alleyways that were nearly impossible to get into, to see into, to get on top of, backsides of houses. Of course, we had, 60, 70 inches of rain down there a year. And we had some severe deterioration situations. And in limited applications, we allowed hardy plank. I would say always, in everything I've ever, in the design guidelines I've been involved with or familiar with, you don't want the hardy plank with a faux wood side, that has the wood graining pattern in it. You want a plain hardy plank. And hardy plank is the name of a particular material. There are a broad range of synthetics that fall within that cementitious siding category. So any of those products can be appropriate. Now, the market is being flooded with synthetic products, okay, in across range, all types of synthetic woods, all types of, synthetic sidings, synthetic fencing. I would say there are, these are areas that we're happy to help give you input on and show you what other communities have done. But in broadly speaking, with synthetic siding, the hardy plank is consistently in limited situations that are well thought out and clearly defined in your guidelines to help give you a way to support what you're doing, so that it's not always coming down to people thinking of you as the fashion police or something like that here, which is your responsibility to enforce guidelines that are based on the Secretary of Interior standards. And so what we want to help is give you those standards, and the standards address those issues in a number of guidelines, a number of situations. So hardy plank can be a reasonable alternative in certain situations. Now, the situation that isn't, I've got a wood house, I don't feel like messing with it anymore, and I just think it'll be easier to do away with the wood and do hardy plank. So I've got 5% of my wood damage, I want to tear it all off and I want to put hardy plank on. I would say that's, generically speaking, a broad application that wouldn't be considered, in most cases, appropriate. Okay, backs of houses, situations where you've got decay and limited access, particularly if it's visually up over a story and you can't see it. Those are all situations that can be appropriate. And some of it does come down to judgment. You can never. The whole reason you're here is because it's going to require intelligent judgment, and that's why we have the camp training, and that's why we give these other directions, and that's why we offer the resources of NAPC and our agency, is so that you can feel confident in the decisions that you're making. But the reason that you have to get together and make these decisions, because there's always an interpretation to a lot of it. At the same time, what we find nationally is roughly about 95% of the answers to all COAs, certificates of appropriateness, are yes. Okay? Is it yes, what you want to do, no tinkering with it, fine. And what we're finding is probably 80 to 90% of that is done by administrative approval, which means it never comes to the commission. That's done very simple, straightforward stuff, repairing with in-kind materials, painting, replacing a 3-tab asphalt shingle roof with a 3-tab asphalt shingle roof. Those are things that never need to come before you, and that most cities have an administrative review through the planning office or through their certified local government coordinator. We highly recommend that. But at the same time, we're finding on a national level, statistically, about 5% of decisions are usually by commissions that are interpreting the guidelines. So,
Mr. Brown, I got one question.
Please.
On the hardy plank siding before we get too far away from that.
Please.
You mentioned that you would normally not recommend the hardy plank that sort of had a wood grain faux-like finish, and you recommended a plain, but wood itself is never smoothly plain. It usually has some grain showing. So I was curious as to why you were not recommending the hardy plank that had more of a faux or a wood-like grain to it.
Well, you're always looking for materials that replace a historic material, but at the same time do not try to create a false sense of history. So that by a grained material is essentially, I think, the The common term that we utilize in industry is more on the phony colony end of it, what we think are in an inappropriate way to mimic history in almost a quiche way, okay, which is what we feel in the industry you need to avoid those kind of approaches towards, whereas anything that would border on Disney-esque or trying to create something that has in too severe a way tries to emulate history and ends up creating a poor-looking replacement for it. HardiePlank, I think, accomplishes the creating the architectural lines, the shadow lines, and the visual basis for its use. At the same time, it retains its own individuality as a product, and ultimately someone could look at it closely and distinguish the difference between that historic material and another historic material. Now, that also makes it hard to match, but I find the worst thing is trying to take a product like particularly a grained HardiePlank and then trying to match that with other. Usually is in the industry that's felt as an inappropriate way to approach historicity and maintaining historic character. So in all the design guidelines that I've been associated with, it's usually highly recommended that only the plain HardiePlank be approved. There's exceptions to everything. So I would tell you at the same time, as long as you have a standard and you feel it meets the Secretary of Interior standards and you're consistent in your application of those standards, that's the important thing. So what we encourage in our functioning of our historic commissions is try to make your guidelines as detailed and clear as possible. When you do make an exception, make it for reasons that you feel meet the basic 10 guidelines from the Secretary of Interior for their standards, and then be consistent in the application of it. The other thing is that once you do allow a product, you always cross a threshold of precedence. So that once you bring a synthetic product into your community, you're going to have a lot of difficulty often down the road of limiting that product. So I think they have to be introduced very, very carefully. Synthetic, wood porches, synthetic decks and things like that, they can be appropriate, and there are appropriate places those can be used. I will tell you in roofs, for instance, faux slate. In my experience, a lot of that faux slate does not, and I don't think you have probably a lot of slate applications in your community, but a lot of those faux slate products do not last. They're also not really fire retardant, and they typically can deteriorate very quickly. So at the same time, there are a handful of good slate products out there. So we're happy to help you find resources of that. I don't know if you're familiar with the Traditional Building Group, but they have a main conference every year in the United States, and then they have 2 regional conferences around, but they're an excellent resource for this. They typically have some very good standards for the vetting and the type of products they represent. So they're often a good resource. But again, we've got these listservs, so we're happy to pull from that. We're also happy to pull from some of the other communities around the state and around our region that are addressing. I talk to CLG coordinators in other states nearby here in Arkansas, obviously in Louisiana, where I came from, areas like that. So we're happy to help give you some guidelines when you're dealing with that. I caution with, we always want to see historic products and historic materials and historic buildings repaired with historic products applied and utilized in historic manners. That's not always possible. The biggest challenges we're going to see are going to be with all the buildings right now. Anything before 1963 is potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And what we're seeing is after of course, World War II, you have this explosion of synthetic materials. So all of these houses now in the 50s and 60s, and it won't be a few more years till it's the 70s, came out with all these materials. They're all obsolete now. So when the time comes to replace those materials in what are going to be historic districts, and there are actually a set of guidelines out now for post-World War II architecture and particularly, ranch houses and all of this architecture that comes after World War II. There are now historic guidelines for designating those as historic places, for individual buildings, and then for addressing historic materials on it. The biggest challenge with all that is how do you replace these historic materials that are long gone? They're no longer available. And those are going to be our big, it's pretty easy to come here with an 1870 house. It's got all this wonderful detail. Our experiences with those places have been so extensive and clear for so long. What do you do with a high quality 1870s pre-Civil War antebellum house, or particularly just a solid 19th century house? It's pretty clear. You want to do in kind. You want to, wood with wood. You want to make sure the thicknesses for the replacements are there. You want to keep the historic materials. Those are the easy ones. We're still having some challenges with the post-World War II, early 20th century items, but still with the arts and crafts and the bungalows, there's just a lot of good experience out there, how that's been addressed, how synthetic materials have been introduced. The challenges that we're all going to face in our careers here in the next 20 years are going to be this post-World War II stuff that's coming online that none of us think of as historic. The ranch houses and these things. We just can't imagine we're going to have individually designated ranch houses that are going to be on the National Register of Historic Places. They're already here. There's going to be many, and those are our challenges. So that's in the same way, being an older person, so to speak. I can remember in the 70s and 80s, as the National Register was obviously getting started and dispersed across the nation here, these bungalows and stuff were not 50 years old yet. People were like, those are junk. And, the real architecture is 19th century. Anything after 1900 isn't really historic. And now we think of those as gems. And I can remember, the shotgun houses at one point were just considered junk. And there were just no way that they were ever going to be historic. Now, communities all across the nation have Shotgun House Month. They revel in them, and they're really some of the great architecture now in these historic districts. And I guess it's hard for me to see it, but I guess we are doing that. We will be doing that with our post-World War II housing development. So those are going to be our challenges. But synthetics are one of the biggest challenges. So don't hesitate to contact us. We'll be happy to help be a part of that. Okay, if you've got one issue or you're trying to look at your guidelines, please let us know. Okay, that's exactly what we'd have to be happy to help you direct. A few other areas, see fences, chimneys, siding. We did siding, signage. Let me talk about chimneys briefly while I'm here. We're seeing more and more, particularly in my commercial areas downtown, what they want a lot of people are coming in, and as these chimneys are starting to deteriorate now, they're 50, 75, 100 years old. Masonry is typically, in that 20 to 50 year cycle. You're going to have to go in and deal with masonry, rehabilitation and or repointing, things like that. Chimneys are extremely important character defining elements of historic buildings. So I would highly encourage you to be cognizant of that. And I don't know if it's addressed in your guidelines or many guidelines around the state, but some communities want to take them down below the roof line, and that's been done a lot around the country. It's generally considered an unacceptable removal of character-defining element of a historic structure. So we would strongly recommend that be something that you would address very carefully, and that typically it's not considered an acceptable approach towards rehabilitation or towards the maintenance of historic structures. So I'm seeing that more as across the state. I'm seeing it as an issue. When I was down in Louisiana, it was a big issue for us. The good thing about them, what you have to realize, most chimneys are not functional anymore. They're never going to be utilized for coal and wood burning. It's important to understand if anybody's renovating or rehabilitating a chimney, are they going to be utilizing it for any type of official function? And 99% of the time, it's no. So the ability to stabilize it requires a lot less concern and finesse than if you're trying to make it functional, and you want to make sure that you don't have any sort of gases leaking into the houses and things like that. That's where you can get some real challenges with rehabilitating historic chimneys, because you can get carbon monoxide potential problems with chimneys and stuff like that. But 99% of the time, that's not an issue anymore with chimneys. But I just wanted to mention that. Fences, some districts regulate fences, some don't. They can be fairly important character-defining elements of areas. I highly recommend that you address them and that you have a policy on it. Every community, it's often overlooked, every community is going to have different fences. They're going to have, some are going to be more focused on whether it's vertical wood fences or horizontal wood fences or certain kinds of metal fences. Now, what we got down there, of course, dry stone fences. I never saw a dry stone fence down in Louisiana that I can remember. I don't go into a community here that I don't see a dry stone fence. So understanding how you would want to approach the maintenance of those and where you would think that they're appropriate. Chain link fences, if you don't have any regulations, you can all of a sudden find somebody putting a chain link fence in front of a historic house that they think may be appropriate, and it can have a very profound, often a very strong impact on the historic character of a neighborhood, or particularly for affect property values in a neighborhood or things like that. So at the core of preservation, of course, is economics. You're creating value with authenticity and also with heritage tourism. People want to come see the real thing. Okay, they're not looking to see something when they come into historic communities. They're not looking to see something that's phony. They want to come see what the real stuff looks like, and that's what sells. You're one of our good examples here. The historic downtown that you have here is, we consider, one of the excellent examples in the state of how it should be addressed and how it should reflect historic character and functioning in a modern environment. You got a very dynamic downtown with a very active business community, and this is exactly the community, one of the communities that we reference and refer to when I go around the state and address these communities that are struggling with their downtowns. What do we do and how do we do it? And we approach it very often the same way we do here with historic zoning, and then often with Main Street, just like you do here, or downtown communities now. So this is something that we recommend. Also, if any of you care to attend, I'll be attending the Main Street conference in April the 13th through the 16th, which is going to be in New Orleans. And the most successful CLG communities in the United States have very strong relationships with Main Street and the downtown program with Main Street. So it's 12 of the 33 across the state are Main Street communities, and it is an interface that we plan on seeing grow in the state here, and again across the nation. The strongest programs in other states and the strongest programs in other cities are interface strongly with CLG communities, with Main Street and CLG. So you're a shining example of how that works in the state here. Signage. Jonesboro has recently come out with an excellent ordinance for signage in historic downtowns. I'll be happy to share that with you. I don't know exactly the status of your current signing ordinance downtown, but Jonesboro put a lot of work into their signage downtown and controlling it. Franklin has also come out with new guidelines on historic signage recently. I say they have just come out or they're fixing to come out, and I've been working closely with them. Franklin has a full-time preservation planner there, so that is something that I would recommend you be very aware of. With the promotion of business nowadays, signage is considered such an important element, and with all of these businesses, at the same time for historic communities, once you cross that line with some of these signs, it'll be very difficult to step back and to control what you might see as problem signage in your communities. Demolition by neglect. Am I taking too much time, Jim? Okay. Demolition by neglect. Again, I don't know how you exactly your ordinance is structured, but there's two ways to address it in your communities. To my knowledge, it's not a big problem in your community right now. You have such an active and well-populated downtown. But You can do it with the public nuisance ordinances you have, just like you would do if someone didn't mow their yard or something. At the same time, you can adopt a separate ordinance for demolition by neglect. And again, Jonesboro has an excellent ordinance, and a few other cities have an ordinance for DB and demolition by neglect. If you're finding it as an issue here in town, please let us know. I think it's been probably one of the largest issues that has been unaddressed by the certified local governments and by historic districts in general. And I keep finding, as I go across the street, it's usually every community's got a couple of examples that are real problems for them. We'll be happy to assist with that and be happy to help make recommendations for demolition by neglect. And I would ask you, are there any technical issues that you find? I know we came together to talk about general things today, and I came up with some of these subjects. Are there any specific issues you want to ask me about while I'm here today? Or, you're welcome to contact me later, and as we're both making presentations, please call me back to the podium. I'm happy to address specific issues with that. Before I let Jim talk, let me just say, thank you for your hard work and for your time and for your volunteerism. I get paid to do this. I get paid to come in the evenings and talk with you. It's not only get paid to do, it's a pleasure, and I enjoy it very much. But you folks, I know you enjoy it, and you're very committed to your communities, and you do it as volunteers. And I want to commend you on that, and I want to commend you on the hard work that you've done here in your community over the years to maintain its historicity and to keep its character and heritage intact. Very important. Of course, it's a big part of our mission here in the state, but you're the front line. You're the ones doing the hard work for nothing. And so for free, not for nothing, but for free. So please see me as a resource. What I'm doing for you is not a favor. It's my job, and I'm happy to do it. Please let me know how I can help you, and please don't hesitate to contact us or our agency at any time if we can assist you in the hard work that you're doing here. Jim, you want to? Any questions?
And you may address this, Jim, but I think probably one of the biggest things that we face is additions or new ancillary structures, or adding of fences of all different sizes and heights and materials. So those are, and you may be planning on talking about that a bit, Jim. I don't know.
Well, and I could address that briefly. As I mentioned, fences, I think, are one of the areas that's generally overlooked in design guidelines. There are some good examples out there, and I highly recommend you come up with some standards for it that are going to help you, rather than dealing with the fences that you've got and trying to figure out how to rein them in. Come up with and it all comes down to materials, heights, how far you're going to let them come up to, essentially fences over 4 feet, you don't come from further than the back of the house. You generally, for certain types of fences, you wouldn't come further than the front edge of the house, things like that. And then, of course, what are appropriate fences to have next to the street. And from a visual standpoint and your effect on your historic character, that's your most important. Additions, again, that's something I guess I generally overlooked here. That is again one of our most significant problems that we face. The Secretary of Interior standards say that you want to have your additions such that they appear, it would be clear to anyone looking closely at the structure that it is an addition to the structure. It would not confuse the historic character of the building, and it would be clear to any person that looked carefully at the structure what was original and what was not. So that typically an addition to the back is meant to come in by a certain percentage and to have a lower roof line, and it would, of course, never have a higher roof line or to be larger. It's about scale and massing. So you never want something to be larger in scale and massing than what was there. Same thing with infills. When you're doing infills here, what you're looking is something that fits from an idea of scale and massing, okay, and fits with the property. But particularly for additions, outbuildings are something that have to be weighed carefully. I think we've all seen the historic neighborhoods that have the metal, inexpensive metal buildings that were thrown up in the back there that can be very inappropriate in historic neighborhoods. Same time, usually, particularly in dense urban neighborhoods where there's a lot of there's a lot of careful placing that can be done with its ancillary structures, dependencies, and things like that. That be very tastefully and easily done without being an onerous financial burden to the people that are trying to do it. extremely important. And again, one of the things I guess I've overlooked in my presentation here, the ancillary structures. But additions are, and you're always going to have challenges on this. You know, these are some of the bigger challenges you will have, because as these districts are becoming more valuable, they're becoming more desirable living places. We're looking at sustainability, walkable, livable downtowns. We're now getting professionals, and these historic neighborhoods are desirable neighborhoods. And as such, people are adding square footage. They're, you know, as they've always done. If you look at the Hermitage, that's what the Hermitage is. It has a smaller house in it. All of these historic buildings you see around here start out often as much older ones start out as log structures that grew into more formal looking structures, and that's exactly what's happening to now in historic districts. So there are guidelines on that, and they're good guidelines on it. And again, you know, let us know if we can help you when those challenges arise. Any other questions? Jim, I hope I haven't taken too much time. I'll leave my stuff up here and come get it when we're finished. Sorry.
I don't really have a formal presentation, but you've been distributed some preservation briefs in your packets today. One is preservation brief number 47, maintaining the exteriors of small and medium-sized historic buildings. Frequently, I mean, this is a document that's really best served by the owners. If you have an historic house, you know that it is not a structure. Any structure is going to require maintenance. And one of the great things about this particular document that it does have guidelines, a frequency chart for inspecting your building, which is it's a very nice tool to have. It talks about roofs, chimneys, roof drainage, windows, entryways, doors, and that kind of thing, and the frequency at which you ought to, as an owner, inspect. Because a lot of the problems that come before us really are when there are problems with their houses and they've got deterioration, and they have to come before us and ask, we've got this situation that's occurred, and what do? We need to then rebuild this section, or the foundation is cracking, because basically they haven't maintained it. And that's the concern that we have, is that we want to make sure they protect it, but yet they put back then appropriate materials. So that's I think the first wave is that the owner protect their building and maintain it properly. And this particular document, I think, is a very good one, a very good tool for the owner of a historic property within our district, which does include, Dan, buildings from the 20th century and the 19th century. We do have some that we have as a commission, have agreed that the more recent structures have different requirements, different design expectations and guidelines, and we've approached them differently than the earlier buildings, which are Victorian or earlier. And so maintaining those structures will have different characteristics based on the age of the particular building, based on those materials. But I think the first front for taking care of your building is simply maintaining it. The next preservation brief that was in your packet that I wanted to go over is then, okay, what happens when you do have a problem? Preservation brief number 16 is the use of substitute materials on historic building exteriors. We, as a group, don't have any control over the interiors. When you were talking about the 20th century buildings, I'm thinking about flocked wallpaper. I don't know where you'd find that necessarily today. I hate to think we'd have to get into that. But this particular preservation brief addresses when to use substitute materials. When you look at substituting materials, you're bringing in other materials that were never in that building that may have different expansion coefficients, and other materials that, like aluminum, that people may want to put in there, aluminum flashing, roofs or penetrations in the roof. Aluminum in contact with steel creates a galvanic reaction, and it will corrode the material. So it's typically best, I've found as a preservation architect, and that's the kind of work that I do in my practice, is to always put back the original materials if you can salvage them, and then substitute materials that are very, very similar. One of the problems we have found in our particular district is when people have not maintained the masonry, and they may go back and put in, instead of lime-based mortar, they may go back and put in Portland cement-based mortar. And the Portland cement is actually stronger than the early 19th century bricks, and so it is not going to allow that brick to expand and contract the way it did, it's going to actually hold it in place. If it freezes and thaws, it's going to spall the face off. I've seen entire walls of buildings that are just pocked with holes where the exterior face of the brick is just cleaved itself off because it is not allowed to expand and contract. So part of that maintenance cycle that's recommended by Preservation Brief 47 is I recommend that you look at all your masonry. Like when you redo your roof, I suggest that you also inspect your chimneys to make sure what condition it's in. Frequently, a chimney, for instance, on a roof, you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, so you're not really seeing the loss of the mortar in those particular joints. And it is lime-based mortar, most likely. It would be based on its age, and it will deteriorate. I've seen it where you can drag your finger in a mortar joint and it falls out like sifted flour. And it's really just a stack of bricks at that point. There's no adhesion by the mortar at all. So I highly recommend that you try to use materials that are appropriate for the age, similar as much as possible, that have the same characteristics of the materials that you're removing. I think that's the best defense. If you're using substitute materials, say for instance for stone, there's now precast stone. There's dry stone, like the synthetic stones that you see some people are using, particularly you see it at shopping centers and stuff on the canopy edges and things like that, or wainscoting on the exterior. That is a dry type of formed stone, false stone. But you need to find materials that have similar characteristics as far as aesthetics and performance, and that will last. So I would carefully look at that. But when you do mix things like aluminum with copper or steel, you're going to have to separate it with a barrier, rubber or some plastic or some other material, so they are not in contact when it gets wet. And if it gets wet, it's going to start to corrode the least noble of the materials, and it will start to corrode, and it will be gone shortly. And that's where you're going to start to get, particularly on roofs, that's where you're going to get leaks. And I think water infiltration is our #1 enemy in houses today. So you have to make sure that envelope is weather tight, because it's going to get in and create all kinds of problems. I think that besides fences, it seems in our commission, it seems like the other thing that we are faced is new exterior additions to buildings, and that's Preservation Brief number 14, which you all also received. If you'll notice throughout, I've been involved with the commission now several years. I've been involved with the community of Murfreesboro for 11 to 12 years. And we have been faced with a number of additions. If you'll notice, I've always sort of, from my perspective as a member of the board, whenever we had additions, I always wanted to make sure, particularly if they're in the back, that they are smaller and inset and they respect the original building, and that the massing is smaller as it goes further back. And that is just a characteristic of historic buildings. That is the way in which they were typically done. You want to find the elevation that is least visible, if possible, for your addition from the street, from the right-of-way. That's actually, in fact, noted in this particular preservation brief. Or a side elevation that is not as important. If you were downtown, for instance, you may have to, if there's a gap, the building is gone and was never built, you may have to infill with that. But in our residential neighborhood that we are involved with protecting, most of our additions have been in the rear because we have skinny front lots but deep. And so most of the additions have gone to the rear. But I think respect of massing that Dan brought up is an important issue. One of the things I've seen in the 12 years I've been involved with Murfreesboro is that our neighborhood is becoming more and more dense. As we put up fences, which are visual blocks, we want our protection and separation to allow our children to play outside. The fences are becoming stockades and blocking the visual view throughout the neighborhood. Kids can no longer run from house to house to house as we all grew up. And as we are now permitting and are seeing, a lot of folks are asking for detached garages, or which are more than just the one story that was there historically. Historically, it was only one car. Well, now we all have at least 2 cars, and some cars that are enormous in size. And so our garages are getting bigger, and then we're putting second floors on them, and we've been faced with a number of detached garages. So our density though it meets the city's requirements for buildable square footage on the property, it is making for a much more dense historic neighborhood. So that's always been a concern of mine, that we're getting more and more dense in our neighborhood as we try to enjoy and improve our neighbors, but we're losing some of those character-defining features of our neighborhood because we're getting a much more dense neighborhood. But those are some of the things that I wanted to bring to your attention. These briefs are available online. The easiest way I go on to find them is I just do preservation briefs, National Park Service, and it'll immediately pop up. Otherwise, it's a little more difficult, sometimes unwieldy to find on the internet. But they are valuable tools. In my profession, I pull these up all the time for guidance on how to do my projects that I do preservation work around the Middle Tennessee area. But I highly recommend these to the Commission, to the people who are listening out, watching on TV, who have projects in mind or have maintenance issues. We are a tool. I consider ourselves as a commission a tool to the homeowners, the property owners in our district to call on us because we should have these resources that we can assist them with, and these are just one of the major things that we can show to them. So I highly encourage everyone to use these documents. Any questions you all have?
No, Jim, I appreciate you getting those together because they're going to be great resource documents for us as we go forward. Thank you.
I want to go back. You mentioned hardy plank before and about it being the grained surface. I've always stayed away from the grained surface as well, only because it gives a weathered wood appearance. And typically a siding, an historic siding, was a fairly smooth surface, but then either the paint has become pocked with the layers have come off or what I call alligatored off, and they're not a nice smooth surface anymore, or the wood has been left to be exposed to the rain and the weather, that the harder grain of the wood starts to pop out where the lighter material in the wood itself starts to shrink back. That's when you get that grained effect. A lot of people happen to like that look. I don't care for it because the original treatment typically is a clean, smooth finish. And that's why I particularly look at that. I see a lot of people today are also going with an architectural roof shingle, which is trying to look like wood shake or slate. And those are, I think, appropriate on certain houses. Other houses, I think they're not. We have also seen a number of metal roofs that have come before our commission. We have standing seam metal roofs, and there are a lot of manufacturers out there who produce that, not only of all the interesting colors that are out there today, but shapes and profiles. I've always steered clear of the 5V metal roofs, and you've seen those come before us before. Those are what I call, farm building roof materials. Standing seam is the kind of roof that should be in our historic district, and I think we just need to make sure that the public is aware that what they're trying to put in is not appropriate or not to our community, to our district. So I think it's just knowing the materials, what is appropriate, and making sure we help guide them to maintain the property, which also increases the value of their property. So that's why I sort of go after some of those particular aspects. Any other questions?
May I make a couple of just follow-up
Dan,
comments
please.
there? And there were a couple of things I thought would be important just to mention here. First, let me say here that I think you probably know the resource you've got here with Jim Thompson, and I hope you're aware of his value and stature in our community. Of course, he's on the National Register Review Committee, et cetera, but he's one of the most highly thought of preservation architects in the state here, and so it's an extraordinary resource, and I would say your community is very lucky to have him involved. People like this usually don't have the time to spend on commission, and I know he devotes a lot to it and to our review committee as well. An extraordinary resource. Portland versus lime. If I talk about a handful of things, I talk about windows we see out here, roofs. The problem with Portland versus lime, and I've dealt with this my whole life, and again, I have a construction background as well, working on historic buildings for decades in historic districts. But the problem is, as Jim said, is the hardness of them, and Also, breathability to a certain extent, but the expansion coefficients. Older bricks are almost like sponges. They absorb water, and they literally expand. A modern brick, no, they're hard as granite. They've got a 8,000 psi. Modern Portland's got a 5,000, 7,000 psi, even higher. So the psi on these bricks and the old mortars are half or a third of that. And what I'll see consistently is they put in that Portland mortar, and then over a period of years, as that brick expands and contracts, it powders literally. And then if you got plaster and you did a plaster over, it'll pull the whole face of the brick off. It takes 10 to 20 years to do it. There's not a mason out there that does it that thinks they're the ones that did that. Okay, but it's been proved historically, time after time for decades, and it's one of our biggest problems because it happens slowly. But when it does, you've lost the structural integrity of the wall. The wall typically has to be replaced. There's another resource we didn't talk about, and I know Jim's familiar with it, is the National Center for Preservation Training and Technology in Natchitoches, Louisiana. But this is the national center. There was a senator down in Louisiana, and instead of this being put near one of our major cities in the United States, he got it put out in the country in Louisiana near a place that he was familiar with. At the same time, it's a fantastic center. They're doing all types of testing. It's a fine group. I've met them and know them, PhDs that work out there on materials all the time. So a lot of what they're doing is this work that we're going to need to understand about synthetic materials. One of the things I want to touch on was coating masonry. Waterproofing. You hear this all the time, and again, they're great selling these products. They make it sound like best thing since sliced bread is going to save your walls and this kind of stuff. In almost all cases, essentially, old historic walls breathe. They absorb moisture. When the sun hits it, they release this moisture, and so you see this when they put a coating. They think that usually there's a problem on the inside with either the masonry hasn't been repointed and it's leaking, so they think, I've got to get it waterproofed. And they put this coating on the historic brick, and you're essentially, in many cases, killing that wall. Because what it does is keeps the moisture in there. When that water starts putrefying, it destroys the quality of the lime in the mortar, and essentially, but it's slow. So it's going to destroy those walls over a period of time. But I would say waterproofing on historic brick walls is now modern brick walls. But if a wall is well pointed, it almost never needs any waterproofing. The idea that it needs waterproofing is a misnomer. Same thing with painting, walls that have never been painted. Most paint today is latex. Latex is plastic. Plastic does not breathe, like linseed oil or even the old oil paints and stuff. So what happens is that it holds that moisture in. It does the same thing as a waterproof coating. So I don't recommend it. You see it. I've had some knockdown, drag-out fights with other preservationists over it. But the information that's continually coming out, and you go to preservation briefs on it, is saying do not coat walls, do not paint masonry. Okay, wood, completely dead. Keep your wood painted, keep it covered. You're protecting the wood. Okay, you want to paint it when it's dry. Okay, if you trap that moisture in there, same thing. Within a few years, it's going to pop that paint off. But if you paint it when it's dry, you're actually protecting the wood, and it's extremely important for wood. Wood should be painted. It should not be unpainted. And typically, historically, it never was unpainted. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you a question. You have a masonry contractor that's going to do some work, some repairing of some brick or taking out the mortar. What kind of ratio? Is there a ratio for lime and cement is there a correct?
Very much so, and I'll be happy if you don't have those in your guidelines. They're listed on in all the preservation briefs.
Well, the preservation briefs also address it. There's a couple of mixtures in there. What I frequently do on my projects is I actually have, if it's a big project, it's usually a commercial project, not a residential, I have an independent laboratory do an analysis of the composition of the mortar so they put it back exactly. But they vary in their mix. It's like any recipe for anything we eat. It's the same thing for mortar, and it's going to vary depending on where it's done and locally and whatever. And so, but there are set volume recipes, if you will, for mortar in some of the preservation briefs. I don't have that with me today, but we can get that for you.
And many of them are sold. Those mixtures are sold under different numbers, M, N, O, and they're already pre-mixed. This is not some some rare science that's going to take a very specialized person to do it, you can easily specify in your that it needs a MSO for certain types of brick, and it's usually very easy to understand that and to apply it. And they're very good printed guidelines out here. I can send them to you, but they're in the preservation briefs. This is something that's been addressed for quite a long time, but it's highly recommended.
And even the lime-based mortars you see have a little bit of Portland in there, but they do not have the high concentration that's in the modern mortars today. But it's a much higher lime content. It's just a softer mortar that's going to protect your brick. Trust me, you want to go that route, because think about too how the bricks were originally made. They were created in like a beehive configuration. They were fired on the interior. So the part that got vitrified, which is really china, bricks today are like china. They're that hard. That's why they don't expand or contract.
They got a fire skin on them.
They're completely fire protected. They're literally like porcelain. And so the old bricks, they built this beehive. They put the fire in there. The bricks that got the closest to the fire were the ones they put on the outside. The outer face of the beehive was the orange, where the pinks and the oranges are. Those were typically used on the interiors of the walls because they're much softer and they cannot hold up to the exterior exposure. So know that your bricks are, like for instance, the Capitol right now, it is comprised of this large stone building, but the floors are brick groin vaults, then stone rubble, then stone floor slabs. Those bricks are what holding it up. Those are very soft 19th century brick, still holding up the Capitol. It's been in use continuously all these years, but the mortar in there is not getting wet. If it were outside, that building would have required a lot more maintenance than it has received. The exterior of that building is stone, so where we have 19th century brick buildings, the mortar is exposed to the outside, is getting wet. Some of it is still very hard. Some of it literally is like flour, and you just have to protect it, but when you go back, you have to put in a lime-based mortar to protect the brick from being damaged.
I think the other thing, when people sometimes criticize historic preservation, they say people are trying to tell me what to do with my property, and nobody should ever be able to tell anybody what to do with their property. And I find that if you want to understand controls and restrictions on property, look at new developments. Almost all, and particularly wherever there's quality and value, there are almost always guidelines and directions. And particularly in, even if it's not a gated community, almost all of your modern neighborhoods have very strict guidelines and with legal consequences for any types of changes that you're going to be making to the scale, massing, and character of the neighborhood. It's all part of modern planning, and almost every city does it. Any neighborhood group for all modern developments that are trying to create value in that group are always going to be establishing well-defined guidelines that have an enforcement policy to them. This is the same thing we're doing with preservation here, and it's really no different than all of what's being done on a modern basis. But we're here to help with any of those challenges. So very often I go to communities if there is any type of questions over that or need to make that understood or help communities to address that as an issue. So thank you very much for having me here tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. It's always a pleasure, and please let us know if we can help.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Please.
And thank you, Mr. Thompson. It's been a great education for all of us, I know. Robert, do we have any more business?
No, we don't have any.
Any reports?
Ms. Linda, I have one thing I'd like to bring up, if I could, and I'm sorry since we're running a little bit late, but a couple weeks ago I got a call from a resident that lives on North Manny, and he was really concerned about a property there that had a recent fire, and it's I think about the 500, maybe 600 block of North Manny on the west side, and the fire was extent enough that the house is going to have to be totally demolished. This resident was concerned about what was going to be built on that property, and currently, previously the house I think was 3 or 4 or 5 apartments, and of course this person was talking about maybe getting a group together as a non profit to purchase the land and then build back what the group wanted to do. And I said, well, maybe this is time for us to see if we can get a vote and extend the North Manny area into an historic zone, which was voted out at the time 20-some years ago when the Main Street Historic Zone was brought in. Because under the protection of the historic zone, if I understand it correctly, if more than 75% of the house is gone and has to be rebuilt, it cannot be rebuilt back as a multifamily dwelling. It has to be built back as a single-family dwelling, and we experienced that on College Avenue, College Street, at the corner of College and Manny, in one house, and that house was built back as a private home. So, Robert, maybe you can get together with Joseph. It might be the time to see if we can stand out a vote and see what the folks in the North Manny area would be interested in becoming a historic zone.
I can do that.
Thank you.
I have one more question, and that is, and this is for you, Robert, I think, is anyone from the city planning to attend the conference that Mr. Brown mentioned in May in Cookeville?
I haven't. I don't know anybody yet. If you're interested, or anybody interested on the commission is interested in going, just let me know, and I'll see what I can do to arrange. Make some arrangements if I can.
I'm actually going to be giving a speech on one of my projects, Wynwood, so I'd be happy to attend.
Will you attend? Is it a 3-day conference or one or?
It's actually 3 days. The camp, I say it's 3 days. The conference sessions are on Friday. Thursday is going to be the camp, and of course, if you show up early, we got a reception and the opening reception with awards are being presented at the reception, statewide awards and TPT awards are going to be done there. So it's all, if you come over, say, Thursday afternoon, if you're not going to attend the camp, but the camp's going to be all day. That's the training. And I would tell you, if you can't do anything else as commissioners, I would highly encourage you to attend the camp if you can't do anything. Now, for the entire conference, Friday is going to be the sessions. And there's 3 different tracks, so there's every hour or so you've got 3 different things you've got to consider, and it's a broad range of technical issues and procedural stuff. It's fantastic. They're doing a great job with the session, the best that I've ever seen. And I did the conference for 2 years, and for 3 years, and I would say as an executive director of TPT, and I would say that I'm extremely impressed. I think it's probably the best group of sessions they've ever had. Yeah. Saturday's going to be most of a Civil War day. They got a Civil War tour in the afternoon, and then some prominent speakers, regional speakers, that are going to come in and talk about, do a couple of presentations on the Civil War in I think the Cumberland Plateau, and then there's a tour out there. But that's included in your base price. So
CAMP is an acronym, and that's on all day Thursday?
Commission Assistance Mentoring Program. And it's a separate, and it's meant to be a fun. It's meant to be fun too. Yeah. They call themselves counselors. It's not a serious, dreary event. Okay, it's meant to be fun. It's high energy. We come there, and these folks are really good. They do a great presentation, and again, some of the finest educators in the nation related to preservation.
Is that open to the public or just to...
Yes, it is. It's open to anyone. We highly encourage commissioners, and it's focused on commissioners, but we have a broad spectrum of people that are interested in preservation, that have served on commissions or in other capacities that come to it. So we encourage, CLG coordinators are the ones that we encourage the highest. Many of our CLG coordinators have been to a lot of training in the last couple of years on it. So we encourage that, at the very least, someone else in the commission and other commissioners, particularly anyone that hasn't been before. But it's always new and timely, so they're always updating. If you've been to them before, you're still going to get a lot out of it. But if you can come on Friday, we make it such that you're close enough. You could run up to Cookeville, get up early, run over there, do it, and come back home. If you say, well, I really don't have 2 days to give or this kind of stuff. We make it such as like 8:30 to 4:30, so you could cram it in there and make a real long day if you wanted to. Okay. But that's the way it's set up.
Send me an email or just let me know if you're interested, and I'll see what I can do.
Okay.
Anything else? Then we're adjourned.